It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Melinda Knutson. Melinda Knutson belongs to a small group of prairie restoration practitioners called the Prairie Enthusiasts. They are working to sustain prairie landscapes in the Driftless region. She is retired from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and works with landowners who want to rewild their land via her Trillium Consulting business. Please join me in welcoming Melinda.
Good morning. I've been looking forward to this for a while. I'm going to start with a little bit of a reading. It's a painting by a man named George Catlin, and he painted scenes of the upper Mississippi River landscape in the 1830s when he traversed the river in a canoe. And these are some of the best known early landscape paintings of our area prior to European settlement. And here's a quote from his letters and notes. "The traveler, in ascending the river, Mississippi River, will see but little of picturesque beauty in the landscape until he reaches Rock Island. And from that point, he will find it growing gradually more interesting until he reaches Prairie du Chien. And from that place until he arrives at Lake Pepin, every reach and turn in the river presents to his eye a more immense and magnificent scene of grandeur and beauty. From day to day, the eye is riveted in listless, tireless admiration upon the thousand bluffs which tower in majesty above the river on either side and alternate as the river bends into countless fascinating forms." So that was a very early explorer's impression of our area, and it hasn't really, the beauty of the area hasn't really changed in all those hundreds of years. So why do prairies fascinate me? Why do I spend my time removing invasives, collecting and spreading seeds, and planting? Why do I work with landowners to inspire them to dedicate a portion of their land to prairies? Part of it is intellectual, cerebral, and part of it is passion, love, which is harder to explain. So what is a prairie? A prairie is a grassland, usually dominated by native grasses and flowers. So that differentiates it from a pasture, for example, which usually has just Eurasian grasses in it. So it's dominated by native grasses and flowers, and it can be remnant, which has been never plowed, or it can be planted. And I'll talk a little bit about both of those kinds. So who cares? Well, prairies are some of the most unique landscapes on Earth, home to many specialized and endangered species. More than 100 plant species can be found on a single site of just a few acres. Prairies engage my interest because they're rare and beautiful, and more than 99% of the original prairies that dominated the Driftless area are gone, plowed under for agriculture, covered by roads and homes and urban areas. This is true of the entire Midwest. It's hard to imagine how different the landscape looked 200 years ago when Catlin was paddling the rivers. A mere blink of time in geologic terms. To fully understand why some of us care deeply about prairies, you have to understand some of the history of the Driftless area. So here's a very brief history of the Driftless. The British remained in control of the lands that are now Wisconsin until the War of 1812. And in 1824, which is 200 years ago now, Native Americans still owned the Driftless area. Interaction with Europeans and Americans focused primarily on trading furs. However, the US government wanted control of the land. And in August of 1825, thousands of Indians from Wisconsin tribes gathered in Prairie du Chien, and federal officials engineered a general treaty of peace. More than 70 treaties were negotiated with the Indians between 1804 and 1854. And these negotiations soon transferred nearly all of Wisconsin to US ownership. In a single generation, under the pressure of overwhelming military force, people who had lived here for centuries or millennia lost their rights to their native lands. They were coerced into moving west of the Mississippi River, or confined onto reservations. In 1832, the Sauk and Meskwaki Indians traveled east across the Mississippi River and fought against being removed from the area. This culminated in the Black Hawk War, a massacre by the US Army and the Illinois militia. Of 1,200 people, including men, women, and children who joined Black Hawk, only about 150 survived, trying to retreat west across the Mississippi River. In 1836, Wisconsin finally had a large enough European population to be a territory, a necessary step towards statehood. Henry Dodge was appointed as the first Wisconsin territorial governor, and 12 years later, in 1848, Wisconsin became the 30th state to enter the Union. Native people managed the land in many ways: hunting, planting corn, beans, and squash. But most relevant for prairie conservationists today, they employed fire in a big way. They burned large areas annually to maintain grasslands, because then the land supported the deer, elk, and a host of native plants used for food, medicine, and religious purposes. Farther west from here, the fires maintained the bison herds. The land and water were their grocery stores, mostly self-sustaining with a little help from fire. 200 years ago, still under Native American control, the Driftless Area was dominated by prairies and savannas, with woodlands primarily along the rivers and north-facing slopes. In short, it didn't look a thing like it does today. So back to George Catlin, I'm going to show you some of his paintings. And he's painted a lot of them in Mississippi. I'm just going to show you a few of them. But he painted some of the most iconic scenes of the Midwestern USA in the early 1830s, when he traversed both the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers. And he's most famous for his paintings of Native Americans and Western landscapes, but his paintings of the Midwest are of most interest to us. So this is called Prairie Bluffs Burning. And he sketched this scene in 1832 on his Missouri River voyage. And this is a quote from his letters. "The prairies burning forms some of the most beautiful scenes that are to be witnessed in this country, and also some of the most sublime. Every acre of these vast prairies, being covered for hundreds and hundreds of miles with a crop of grass, which dies and dries in the fall, burns over during the fall or early in the spring, leaving the ground a black and doleful color. Over the elevated lands and prairie bluffs, where the grass is thin and short, the fire slowly creeps with a feeble flame, which one can easily step over, where the wild animals often rest in their lairs until the flames almost burn their noses, when they will reluctantly rise and leap over it and trot off amongst the cinders, where the fire has passed and left the ground as black as jet." Unquote. European settlers were frightened by these big fires, and fire suppression quickly ensued. And this is the case as well today. Unfortunately, in our climate, in the absence of fire, woody vegetation quickly takes over grasslands. We get too much rain on average here to discourage trees. With European settlement came farming, cities, and roads. Fire was suppressed, and woodlands began to recolonize most areas not under cultivation. But as late as the 1940s, those south and west-facing slopes were still largely open prairies because they're so hot and dry in the summertime. So because the native people did all that burning, we still have remnant prairies, usually on south and west-facing slopes of our bluffs. So this is Madame Faribault's Prairie, above Prairie du Chien, is actually the title of this painting. And what I want you to notice on the next series of slides is how bare the bluffs are. There weren't any trees on these bluffs. This is probably west-facing. They're probably paddling north, and this is a west-facing slope. And I'm going to show you a series of slides that will show you how bare the bluffs were. And the prairies that we have, the remnant prairies and the driftless that we have today, are mostly these remnants of these former bluff prairies that covered the landscape. This one is called Dubuque's Grave. And here is another quote from Catlin. "Dubuque's Grave is a place of great," and this is probably Dubuque, Iowa. Dubuque's grave is a place of great notoriety in this river, in consequence of it having been the residence and mining place of the first lead mining pioneer of these regions by the name of Dubuque, who held his title under a grant from the Mexican government, I think, and settled by the side of this huge bluff on a pinnacle of which he erected the tomb to receive his own body. You can see there's a cross there, and placed it over a cross with his own inscription on it. At the foot of this bluff, there is now an extensive smelting furnace where vast quantities of lead are melted from the ores which are dug out of the hills in all directions about it. So this is a picture of La Crosse from 1867. And also I want you to notice how bare the bluffs are. And it doesn't look like they've started to mine Granddad's Bluff yet because it seems like it's intact. But you can see that there's very few trees on the west-facing slopes. This is a picture that is near Genoa. And this is from, what did I say here? 1907. And so we're moving forward in time. And again, you can see how bare the bluffs are still in 1907. And remember, Catlin was paddling around in the early 1830s. This is a picture of my grandpa, Christian, and my three cousins. Unfortunately, my sister's not in there. She was similar age there as them, but my cousins Leonard, Nancy, and Edward. And this is a picture somewhere near Spring Grove. I'm not exactly sure, but you can see still behind them the bluffs and how bare they are. And this is from the 1940s, sometime in the 1940s. So, you know, there's been a lot of succession of trees, even since the 1940s in this area. This is Rush Creek. I'm going to say a little bit about it, but the Wisconsin DNR has spent a lot of time restoring the goat prairies here, and so that's what this is. Our remnant prairies are repositories of biodiversity, with plant and animal species tuned to one another in complex and sometimes mysterious ways. Grasslands have moved around North America over hundreds of thousands of years as climates changed, growing mainly where rainfall limits the growth of trees. These time frames are long enough that plants and animals have had time to co-evolve, which means that many of our native insects can only reproduce on certain plants. This is especially true for our native moths and butterflies. But unlike many rare things, it is possible to make more prairies, more moths, more butterflies. And hence, we have the Prairie Enthusiasts. In the Driftless Area, our unique topography has resulted in remnant prairies on many, if not most, steep south and west-facing slopes. So there's a few of these remnants left, but they're being encroached with other vegetation, woody vegetation. Termed goat prairies or hill prairies, these are open grasslands that are remnants of the ancient driftless landscape. And people are only recently coming to recognize the importance of restoring and protecting these biodiverse patches of land. And Lori here owns one of those. Maybe some of you do too. The hills in this slide are Rush Creek, across the river from Lansing, Iowa. So if you drive on the Wisconsin side down to Prairie du Chien, you'll see these bluffs. And maybe you've wondered, like, why are those bluffs bare? That's because the DNR hires contractors and does some of the work themselves to to clear the woody vegetation from them and to burn them. And they maintain some timber rattlesnake dens in those areas. Timber rattlesnakes are endangered, I think, both in Wisconsin and Minnesota. Anyway, so the DNR manages these hill prairies, burning them often to maintain them as prairies. These hills host rare habitat for timber rattlesnakes, lizards. We have lizards in Wisconsin on some of these bluffs, and many other rare plants and animals. Friends of the Blufflands, right here in La Crosse, do similar work on these blufflands surrounding La Crosse. And you may have noticed that some of our bluffs are getting bare, more and more bare as the Friends of the Blufflands do similar work here. Prairie restorations in the Driftless area focus largely on these remnant hill prairies and a few dry sand prairies like Holland Sand Prairie up by Holman that made very poor ag fields. So they were a remnant because they were so sandy that you couldn't plow them or get any corn from them. Restorations remove the overstory competition from trees and shrubs that shade out the native grasses and flowers. Native plants are incredibly resilient. It takes only the removal of this overstory, some controlled burns, and the wildflowers will bloom again quickly. Often the plants have been surviving just barely underneath this understory, waiting for the sun to shine again. And even if the plants have succumbed to competition, their seeds remain viable in the soil for decades, ready to reestablish the plant community when optimal conditions return. Here are some of the names of these species: Henslow sparrow, Bell's vireo, bobolink, dickcissel, timber rattlesnake, six-lined race runner, pickerel frogs, regal fritillaries, Atoe skippers, Gorgon checkerspot butterflies, wild indigo, dusky wing and hickory hairstreak moths, prairie bush clover, brittle prickly pear, try to say that fast, Hill's thistle, dragon wormwood, white camas, small skullcap, and dotted blazing star are some of the names of these plants and animals. One reason for the demise of the prairies has already been mentioned in the children's talk, and that is that over thousands of years, the prairie ecosystem built incredibly rich soil. Did you ever wonder where all the rich farmland in the Midwest came from? It came from the prairies. Those prairies built all that wonderful soil. European farmers settling in the Midwest were quick to recognize the economic value of the Midwestern prairie farmland, and they quickly found ways to plow up as much of it as possible. In short, the prairies were largely plowed under in just a few decades. Consequently, a second focus of prairie conservation is reconstructing or planting prairies, usually on former cropland. US government has subsidized landowners, primarily farmers, to set aside steep or unproductive farmland for many years, what is now called the Conservation Reserve Program. In more recent years, the CRP program subsidizes the planting of prairie grasses and forbs, flowers, on CRP. Although the species diversity is depauperate compared with a native or remnant prairie, recent concerns about population declines for the monarch butterfly have prompted additional federal and state government subsidies of prairie plantings. I personally spent a lot of time as a child hoeing milkweeds in the cornfields at our farm near Houston, Minnesota. So every year the milkweeds would come up with the corn. I'd have to go out there in June, hoe down all the milkweed, and then the corn would get larger, but the milkweeds would come back underneath that canopy of corn. And that went on every single year. Every year they reestablished themselves inside the cornfield. Incredibly, research has shown that the monarch butterflies do better in milkweeds that are inside a cornfield than they do anywhere else. They produce better. So they were like almost co-evolving with this corn thing. But unfortunately, let's see here, wrong thing. Genetically engineered Roundup-ready corn and soybeans and the ag practices associated with them have nearly eradicated milkweeds from ag fields, leading to a crash in the monarch butterfly populations. So now the state and federal governments encourage landowners to plant prairies on former crop fields to keep the prairie plants and all the associated animals and plants alive. Planted prairies rarely have the plant diversity that a restored prairie remnant has, but they do have the advantage of occupying fairly large acreages. Former crop fields converted to prairie grasses and forbs can be 40 or 50 acres in size. In a few unique places in Wisconsin, hundreds of acres of former cropland have been converted back to prairies by stitching together prairie remnants and planting open land. So how to get involved? My role in all this has been to engage with the nonprofit called the Prairie Enthusiasts, and specifically the Coulee Region chapter that covers La Crosse, Vernon, Monroe, Buffalo, and Trempealeau, Jackson counties in Wisconsin. And there's chapters in Minnesota and Northern Illinois as well. I'm now on the board of the Coulee Region chapter. I also work part-time as a consultant to landowners in ways they can rewild their own land. That is, restore native plants and animals through my Trillium Consulting business. And one time in the past, I also served as a board member for the Mississippi Valley Conservancy, which also does a lot of work on prairie restoration and encouraging landowners to set aside some of their land. I encourage anyone who's looking for a passion project and who doesn't want to be bored to get involved in one of these organizations. Let's see here. Can't remember if I need to go one more. Yeah, there we go. So that's the prairie story that engages my head, my curiosity. But what about passion? Why do I spend my free time rewilding my own property, volunteering to help TPE restore prairies elsewhere? Those goat prairies are steep. Work can be hot and heavy. Seems odd that people volunteer for such tasks when they could be watching TV, drinking beer, engaged in social media. So I thought about this, like, how can I explain this to people? The secret is that we have fun doing something together that we think is worthwhile. It's as simple as that. Fresh air, camaraderie, the beauty of the prairie, and once the prairies start to bloom, the harder you look, the more you see. More species, more bugs, more ecological interactions. I'm always amazed by a walk in the prairie. For example, my tiny reconstructed prairie at home is covered with green and blue damselflies most of the summer. I only remember seeing one or two of these creatures before I planted my prairie. All kinds of butterflies and moths have showed up just because I planted that prairie. I tell my students and clients that if they learn to be a naturalist, they'll never be bored because they can never learn it all. I could probably see some insect that's new to me just about every day if I looked hard enough. I'll never forget the first time I saw a bumblebee struggling to climb into a cream gentian in my garden. No other bee can pollinate gentians because their flowers never actually open. Only bumblebees have the strength to part the petals and climb in, and then they root around in there collecting pollen. Looks like they're stuck in a gunny sack. So I wanted you guys to see that. So Heather has done her magic, and I think we'll get a little video here of that. This is a blue gentian. So he says, I'm going to find an easier one. That one is too hard to get in. Oh, that one fits perfect. So you see, if you plant a prairie in your yard, you could just take your chair and sit there all afternoon and be entertained. Oh, there's one more. I forgot that. This is it. I did read that these gentians have the richest sugar content of the nectar, so they give them a big reward for climbing in there. And of course, the pollination happens because they climb in there, they get covered with pollen, they go to the next plant and they pollinate that. And so it's a co-evolution thing, which is really amazing if you think about it. So if you want to learn how to plant and tend a prairie garden in your yard or small public space, I'm speaking at the Upper Miss National Wildlife and Fish Refuge. It's part of their 100th anniversary celebration. Saturday, March 2nd at 1 o'clock, I'm going to talk about how to plant a little prairie garden in your, in a small space. And they're doing a prairie walk, and they're actually handing out prairie plants, and you can plant some. Anyway, they got a whole thing planned. Also, I have some handouts out there on the table. If you want to pick up one, one is on how to become a naturalist. It has all my suggestions for books and things, some of my cards, and some of the Prairie Enthusiast, folders. You don't have to be a landowner to join the Prairie Enthusiasts. You can live in an apartment downtown or whatever. You don't have to be able-bodied to join the Prairie Enthusiasts. And they do have a conference coming up, which Heather put in the newsletter, that is by Zoom. So if you really get interested in prairies, there's going to be a Zoom opportunity if you want to listen to some lectures by some great prairie people. Okay, the plant, the pollen, the bumblebee, and the weather are all engaged in an intricate dance that we humans only understand superficially. In a world that seems increasingly broken, at risk of climate change, species extinctions, unsustainable agricultural practices, rewilding even small areas with native prairies is satisfying and ultimately a labor of love. However, many of the prairie enthusiasts have gray hair and are aging out of being able to work on steep slopes. We need to find ways to engage young people in this work. Plus, we don't want them to miss out on all the fun. I can envision a cadre of young people having fun together outdoors, doing meaningful work as an alternative to indoor activities. One of our biggest challenges as leaders of the Prairie Enthusiasts is finding ways to engage the younger generations to carry on this work, because it isn't going away. It will be an ongoing effort to keep invasive species and woody vegetation at bay, to allow our prairies to thrive and support entire communities of plants and animals. It will be a multi-generational effort where the young learn from the old, itself a story as old as humanity. Rewilding is my work and my passion. I can't think of anything more rewarding. So I'm going to end with a poem. This is a poem by Michael Brandt about his wife, Janet, and her work restoring Mounds View grasslands near Madison. And that's one of those areas where they've restored hundreds and hundreds. As far as the eye can see is prairie. It's unbelievable. And they did it by stitching together remnants and then buying croplands, and over time planting seeds from those remnants. It's quite amazing. So this is called Queen of the Prairie. Upon this ridge a flower stands, half hidden to the careless eye. The tireless work of loving hands, fair treasures all about it lie. A panoply of leaf and stem, of flesh and blood, of death and birth, a will surpassing all of them and pulling heaven down to earth. Yet it was not always so. This ridge has seen in seasons past a single lineage left to grow, and cattle dumbly clipping grass. No, what is here is what was planned by one whose vision came to be resurrection of the land in honor of her ancestry. And though the ridge awaits the day its mentor fails to greet the dawn, her essence will forever stay commingled with the soil thereon. Thank you.